All right, so you have a server and the clients need to communicate with that server. Typically, we use HTTP. This is the world we're most familiar with. If you go to google.com, you're sending an HTTP request, and the server responds with whatever content it got, and the connection ends right there. This is not ideal. If you think about the chat application, you got multiple interactions. You expect many back and forth between the server and the client. And WebSockets are the solution for that scenario. But the client initiating that request, just like you did with the HTTP, but unlike HTTP, the connection remains until either the client or the server decide to terminate it. That light, these WebSockets are similar to electrical sockets. Make a connection and it remains connected until you unplug it. This is the implementation of WebSockets for Python. And when you run the scripts, it starts the WebSocket server. Now, when you run the server, this log message function is invoked. It messages from the client, and it logs it into a text file. That's all. I'm going to run this. This is a Python implementation of the client side. It could be on browser as well if you write a piece of JavaScript code that looks actually quite similar. And the whole idea here is that you connect to the web server, and notice this is not HTTP anymore. This is a WebSocket protocol. And this is the port that on the server side we specified we're going to serve on this port. And once you have that WebSocket connection, you're going to send a message called hello world, and then you wait to receive a message. And when you receive the message, just print it there. And I'm running it 3 times. All right, so let's run this code. And on the client terminal, you can see it says received logged 3 times, which means the message was sent to the server and the server responded. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the logs, you can see it's been printed. It's more than 3 times because I have run this before recording as well. I'm going to show you how you can integrate WebSocket servers in your Flask application. On the browser, the client essentially opens this chatbot, goes to the root URL, and start communicating or chatting with the app server. These are Flask application. And then the Flask application, while it's communicating with the client, acts as a client to the logging server. The logging server is pretty much what we described already. All right. So let's start with a bare-bone Flask application that just renders the browser. You import it, you create an app, you run the app, and when you get a request to the root URL, or root endpoint rather, you render this index.html file that is sitting right here. Right, so it works. And now, well, this wouldn't do anything because on the server side, we don't have anything to handle this chat communication. We need to build that WebSocket server within it. Now, given what you already learned, you could add the code here using the WebSockets library to start a WebSocket server in another thread while you're running this. You might imagine this could get pretty messy pretty quickly. So the community has created these libraries on top of Flask to enable WebSocket utilities quite easily, which is what I'm going to show you next. So in this code, I have added that chat capability between the client and the server. So let me first demo it. Hi, bye. All right. So let's now look at the code. what you would do is you import the Flask sock library. There's an alternative to this, which is Flask socket IO, which doesn't really matter at this point which one you want to use. The code remains unchanged except for a couple areas. One is that you create that WebSocket and you create an endpoint. Here I call it chat endpoint. You can name it whatever you want. And you're saying that when a client connects to that chat endpoint WebSocket, I want you to do this. Listen to the messages that are coming from the client, receive the message in a while loop. And what it does actually is that it waits here. It waits for that message to come in and print it and then come up with a response that says, hey, you said this, and then send it back to the client. And that's what exactly happened. Might be interesting to look at the network activity here. So I'm gonna go to the inspect network, reload the page. So initially you got that HTTP request to get the index.html, and then you have this WebSocket connection to the chat endpoint. And if I say hi, that's another event. The event is to send a message. The first event was to, and by the way, you can see down here, the first event was to open that connection. And then, so you send a message and then you got the message that says, you said hi, and that information is reflected up here. And you're using the same connection, or WebSocket connection, to send and receive messages, as you can see, and now the bot said you said bye, right? So now we have this piece complete. What we want to do next is all these interactions between the client and the server, we want to log them in a text file. To complete the picture, you've got to have this logging server that we actually just looked at the top of the video, and I'm going to show you what that looked like. So this is the logging server. It uses the WebSockets. I didn't use Flask sock because that was an overkill. Now if you look at this app server, what it's going to do is it's going to be pretty much the same as what you saw before, except that you have these two lines of code. And what they do is that they send the message either from the client or from the server to the logger server. And the implementation of this function is up here. So you make a WebSocket connection to our logger server, and you send a message, and the message here is what the client said or what the server said. And then wait for the logger server to respond and just print that response. Send. Now, what happens here is that the client said that to the server responded and then sent two messages to the logging server, and the logging server would log them here. And you can see that's exactly what happened. So I'm going to say me again. This is me again.